received a PhD in zoology from Duke University. She married Gerald Durrell in 1979 and spent 15 years with him, writing and making television programs about natural history and conservation. She became involved with the conservation work of the Durrell Wildlife Conservation Trust, of which she is the honorary director. She was also instrumental in reopening Madagascar to Western scientists during the early 1980s. Her first book, The State of the Ark, was a comprehensive review of species conservation published in 1986. She maintains a deep interest in her late husband's legacy, receiving the MBE for services to conservation in 2011. This year, as most of us know, marks the centenary of Gerald Durrell. In conversation with Lee is Vikram Iyengar, Kolkata-based arts leader and connector. A recipient of numerous awards, including the Ustad Bismillah Khan Yuva Purushkar for Contemporary Dance by the National Sangeet Natak Academy, Vikram is a familiar face in the Kolkata Lit Meet. However, I don't know how many of you know that he also has a degree in zoology and has been a huge fan of Gerald Durrell's and Lee Durrell's. I'm delighted to invite onto stage Lee and Vikram and hand over the reins to Vikram for the session.
Thank you, Shahana, for that introduction. I am absolutely delighted, as Shahana has already mentioned, to be in this session with Lee. I'd like to begin with full disclosure. A few months ago, when just in informal conversation with Malavika, she mentioned that Lee Durrell will be here during the Lit Meet. I said that Eta amake dao, as in give this session to me, because it wasn't a request, it was a demand. Because like many of us here, probably I grew up reading Gerald Durrell's works, and he really opened up to me a world of wonder and delight. And I think his books continue to do so, generation after generation, and triggering our imaginations, tickling our funny bones, and really creating an empathy with all the living beings that we share this planet with. This sense of wonder and absolute delight that comes through. I just want to begin by quoting something from his very vivid prose, which those of us who have read him will know. And this is from this book, which sadly is not available at the bookstore, but available on Amazon. So, but this is the book that we will be talking about. And I'm quoting, I remember vividly the first time I entered a tropical rainforest. I spent a whole day bewildered and enchanted by all the sights, sounds, and scents. The leaf mold alone contained hundreds of insects I had never seen or heard before. Roll over any rotting log and I found a world as bizarre as anything thought up by science fiction. Each hollow tree was an apartment block containing anything from snakes to bats, from owls to flying mice. Every forest stream was an orchestra of frogs, a ballet of tiny fish, and from the canopy high above came the constant rain of fruit, twigs, and pirouetting blossoms thrown down by that great army of creatures, mammals, birds, reptiles, and insects that inhabit this high, sunlit, flower-scented realm. I did not know where to look next. Every leaf, flower, liana, every insect, frog, fish, or bird was a lifetime study in itself. And I knew that there was another hidden, secretive army of creatures that would emerge at night to take over. As any naturalist knows, there is nothing like a tropical rainforest for replacing arrogance with awe. And I really think that that's a huge lesson for the human species in this day and age when we are hearing drill, baby, drill. How do we replace arrogance with awe and share this planet with all those that we are meant to share it with? On that note, we will return to this book, Myself and Other Animals, but I'll ask Lee to tell us a little bit about that book and maybe talk about how he began writing it.
Well, hello, everybody. It's lovely, actually, to be here. I've been writing to Malavika for about 6 years, and we've finally come to this moment, and I'm just delighted. It's been a fantastic experience. What Vikram said is, well, first I should say that this year is the 100th year of Gerald Durrell's birth. He was born in 1925. And so you can imagine how old that makes me feel. But he had been, over the years, while we were married, had been writing an autobiography, little in bits and pieces, and there were fragments, but he never actually published it. And so in this his 100th year, I got together with his agent, the agent for his estate, and we said, well, let's just do a good compilation of Gerald Durrell's work, some of the already well-known ones, but there's lots of stuff in the archive, like these fragments from this autobiography, and a number of other things as well. So that's how this book has come about. And I do apologize for it not being here, available in the shop, but as Vikram said, I think you can get it on Amazon or something. But I think maybe I'd just like to open by the first words that he wrote of this unpublished autobiography, and it's entitled How to Give Birth to an Autobiography. And it's really, he says, when you set out to write your autobiography, it has, as I've discovered, a very salutary effect on diminishing one's self-esteem. Full of enthusiasm, you've sharpened up your goose quill, the inkwell is brimming, the capacious sandbox is ready to dry each precious sheet of parchment. But then you're suddenly overcome with terrible doubts, the chief one being that while you know you are the most interesting person in the world, will everyone else share your view? A disturbing thought. There cannot be, you say smugly to yourself, anyone in the English-speaking world who is so uncouth and illiterate as to not share your views of yourself. Comforted with this taradiddle, you announce your intention to your friends. They immediately laugh and say that you've written over 30 books, most of which have been more or less autobiographical, so what is there left to say? I explain, rather tartly, that when you've traveled as much as I have and met such an extraordinary variety of Homo sapiens and other astonishing creatures, there is always plenty more to say.
So this is a book which has many more, but not all of that plenty more to say. So I think let's trace through the book and through his other writings as well. Some of us, we know that he was born in Jamshedpur in India, so he has a very strong India connection, at least having been born here. So, and it's there in the autobiography, right? His memories of
Yes,
India.
yes, the autobiography. He started out with his birth in Jamshedpur, which, by the way, I had the great privilege of visiting the last time I was in India. And it was his father, Lawrence Durrell Sr., was an engineer for the Tata Steel Company. And that's why Jerry was born in Jamshedpur, because Lawrence Sr. did so much work for the company, both the admin block and the hospital and such, and the bungalow in which Jerry was born. So I actually visited that a few years ago, which was great. But let me just read you a little bit about his early recollections of India. I was born in Jamshedpur, India on 7th January 1925. My diminutive mother swelled up to an unwanted degree while she was pregnant, and went into hiding because she was so ashamed of her enormous size. She said she was infuriated by my father because he suggested that what she needed to do was to get out and about and go down to the club. She said to him, "How can I possibly go out looking like this? I look like an elephant." Whereupon my father suggested that she wore a howdah, and she didn't speak to him for 2 days. My first really coherent thoughts were at the age of 2. That was a time when, I think, my senses of smell, hearing, and touch and taste developed. My sense of color came from watching everybody around me who was dressed so beautifully, so subtly, and yet so flamboyantly. I remember going for a walk one day with my ayah, who was wearing a snow-white sari. We were walking along a laterite road, and I noticed how marvelous the white was against that extraordinary, almost blood-red soil. At one point during our walk, we met some friends of hers, and again I was astonished by colors. The man wearing a turban was dressed all in white with a green cummerbund, but his wife, as gaudy as any bird, was wearing a magenta sari. I was riveted by it, and it's remained one of my favorite colors. I left my ayah, who was bent on a long gossip, and wandered to the edge of the road, where there was a shallow ditch in which were 2 slugs. To me, they looked enormous, but they were probably only 3 or 4 inches long. They were gently sliding over each other in what looked like a dance. They were a pale coffee color with black ridged stripes. They were glutinous and beautiful. I watched them for some time, until my ayah suddenly discovered I'd escaped her, and she came and told me I must not touch slugs, as they were dirty. I could not understand that she should think such beautiful, shiny creatures could be dirty. And throughout my life, I've met so many people who think things are disgusting or dirty or dangerous, when they're nothing of the sort but miraculous pieces of creation. There was a little local zoo, and once having been there, nothing could keep me away. In fact, it drove my ayah to despair, because twice a day she had to take me for a walk, and when asked where I wanted to go, I would say zoo, loudly and belligerently. My ayah was forced to complain to my mother that there was no other place I wanted to go for my walks, for if I was not taken to the zoo, my screams of frustration could be heard to the top of Mount Everest and as far south as Australia. I remember the lovely black freckles on the leopard skin, and the tiger as he walked to and fro, looking like a rippling golden sea. It was the strong scent of these big cats that lingers in my memory. To me as a child, this zoo was a magic place, and it instilled in me my deep interest in and love of animals.
So from that early recollection, you will, I mean, it's clear the direction that this man is taking, and we will be talking about both, well, not slugs necessarily, but little brown things, little brown jobs, as he called them, and his interest in zoos, which was where the Durrell Trust is right now. But perhaps we can begin with his writing, and how and why did he begin writing? Because he was, going across the world collecting things, animals. So why and how did he begin writing?
He began really when he was a child. His brother was the famous writer Lawrence Durrell. Lawrence was 12 years older than Jerry, and when Jerry was a little boy of 10, they lived in Corfu, and Larry was always telling him to write down his experiences and what he felt about things and how he saw things. And in fact, his first ever publication, Jerry's first ever publication, was when he was about 10 years old, and he wrote a poem and an essay, and that appeared in Lawrence's journal that he published in Paris back in the 30s. And then he wrote a wonderful story about being a man in Africa collecting animals. Predictive, I think. And and I've got the original manuscript of that, and it's absolutely wonderful. It opens with saying he was a friend of all animals, all misspelled, of course. But then what happened was he, as you know, lived in Corfu. He then worked in a zoo. He then started traveling the world, collecting animals for zoos is what he did. All he wanted to do in life was spend the rest of his life with animals, so this was one way he felt that he could do it. But those expeditions were really rather expensive, and after his first one, he started doing pieces for radio, writing for radio, and those were actually very successful. And after another expedition or two, it was his first wife, Jackie, who said, "Well, look, why don't you sit down and write some of these and write them up?" And sure enough, he did. He wrote his first book, I think it was the early 50s, and it was almost an instantaneous bestseller. And he really found out that he could write. Now, whether he enjoyed it or not, that's another question.
I think he does say something about that in the book as well, about not enjoying the discipline of writing or something. It's there somewhere in some chapter. And also, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but that was also a way to fund the expeditions and collecting trips.
Absolutely, that's really why he started writing, because he needed the money to do another expedition to make more. But he never made any money. He always lost money on the trip, and that's why he had to write in between these trips. But his whole point from the very beginning, he always wanted to have his own zoo, and those seeds were planted clearly in India. And as time went on, he got very discouraged because he would look after all these animals he collected, West Africa, South America, and the like, look after them well and learn how to feed them and how to care for them, then bring them back to the zoos in the UK of the day, which were hardly more than menageries. And these people really didn't look after the animals, didn't know how to look after the animals, and quite often they would die. And Jerry would come to them and say, you know, what happened? What happened? And they say, oh, dear boy, don't worry. There are plenty more where they came from. And Jerry was in the position to know that this was absolutely not the case. This was back in the late 40s, early 50s. And he, even then, of course, he was witnessing the loss of animal life around the world, mostly at that time due to habitat destruction or degradation, pollution, overhunting, certainly overexploitation. And he decided, well, I'm going to have my own zoo, but it's going to be a zoo with a purpose, which is to save species from extinction. I'm going to bring in rare species that need the kind of care that a good zoo can give, breeding and the like. And then eventually, if we've saved them from extinction, they haven't disappeared forever, we may be able to return them back to the wild where they belong. And this was in his head from the late 40s to the time he actually started his own zoo, which was in 1959.
So we'll come to that zoo, which is still going strong, and has done, and it's also expanded. Well, not the zoo has not expanded globally, but that you've seeded so many projects globally as well. But we'll come to that.
Okay. But what Jerry did, he started the zoo in '59, but he turned it into a charitable trust, you know, not-for-profit organization that then ran the zoo, but also was able to carry out his conservation mission in other parts of the world. As Vikram said, we work all over the world, but we'll come to that in a minute.
But between India and the UK, because when he talks about colors and scents and sounds in that chapter, in his early memories in India, and then there's a line somewhere where he's talking about the fact that that could not have happened in England, that sort of onslaught of color and smell. But then he arrives in Corfu as how old was he at that point?
They were about 10 when the family moved to Corfu,
Yes,
but clearly they were missing India so much. His mother was missing India. And when Jerry was 10, Lawrence said, look, we must leave England. It's just grey and dreary and terrible. And so that's what, and Lawrence had a writer friend who'd moved to the Greek island of Corfu. And that's where they decided to go. And Jerry has a wonderful description about arriving in Corfu. And he says it reminded him of that, you know, the film The Wizard of Oz and Dorothy in Kansas, and early in that film, it's all in black and white. And Jerry said arriving in Corfu was like stepping out of the basket from the black and white world into the world of Technicolor of Corfu. And it really was like that, and they just loved the place. Do you want me to read the intro? Yes. Sorry, hang on a second. So direct from My Family and Other Animals. This is when they arrived in Corfu. And again, this I think shows what a fantastic writer Jerry was, so lyrical and poetic. And it goes like this. They were on a ship from Italy, and the ship was arriving in Corfu at about dawn, and this is what happened. Then suddenly the sun lifted over the horizon, and the sky turned the smooth enameled blue of a jay's eye. The endless meticulous curves of the sea flamed for an instant, and then changed to a deep royal purple flecked with green. The mist lifted in quick lithe ribbons, and before us lay the island, the mountains as though sleeping beneath a crumpled blanket of brown, the folds stained with the green of olive groves. Along the shore curved beaches as white as tusks, among tottering cities of brilliant gold, red, and white rocks. The shallow sea in the bays was butterfly blue, and even above the sound of the ship's engines, we could hear, faintly ringing from the shore like a chorus of tiny voices, the shrill, triumphant cries of the cicadas.
Yes, that's why we read Gerald Durrell, because he can create images like that and take us to places that we may never go to otherwise. And also in Corfu, because of where the family lived and how they lived, and the island, the way the island was, that's where his collecting actually also began, his picking up of animals and bringing them into the house, much to the dismay of the rest of his family, scorpions leaping out of matchboxes, etc. when you're talking about that's all he wanted to do with his life, that sort of began in Corfu. And I thought just another little bit that I found in the book, which talks about what he encountered when he was traveling South America, Central America, Australia, Africa a lot. So when you travel about the world in search of animals, you do not follow the well-worn trail of the tourist. You do not check in at the local Hilton. You do not have ice in your drinks, nor get your shoes polished. Your abode is more like to be a mud hut or a bamboo dwelling with none of the refinements of hot and cold running water, but with a multitude of fascinating creatures, from scorpions and snakes to snails and spiders, sharing the hospitality with you. I am not saying that you do not grab at the luxuries when you can get them, but by sticking to the tourist trails, you are less likely to meet fascinating animals, both human and otherwise. And I think reading his books, the characters that he brings to everyone he meets, whether they are Homo sapiens or not, is just incredible, because each one is a personality that is fully fleshed out, and that is the delight that you recognize in the world that you inhabit as well, because they all have personalities.
I think, can I just say, Vikram, I think that's one of the most important observations that could be made about Jerry's work. That is, the way he writes about animals. Sometimes he's been accused of being anthropomorphic, giving too many human characteristics to the animals. But it wasn't that at all. He wrote about animals with not with a great sentiment, but he got people to sort of get under the animal's skin, to connect with the animals, to understand them better. And by sort of giving them human characteristics, he made them more familiar to people. So people did feel more connected and tied to animals. And that is something that is so important in the world today. We've become all so divorced from the natural world and from the world of animals through devices or, horrible things that happen in the world. But that's what we've got to do. We've got to reconnect. And I think reading Jerry gets you to reconnect to nature and feel an empathy and have an emotional side to that connection.
And he manages to get you to connect to all kinds of animals, not just the box office, as he calls it, but also the little brown jobs, the toads and the snails and the slugs that we encountered in that chapter from Jamshedpur. So if you could talk a little bit about that, and maybe if we could read something from the browleaf toad about their personality.
Yes, Jerry was... as you could tell so far, that he loved all sorts of animals, whether creepy crawlies or not. But he felt that the kind of animals that most zoos had on display, were the big, sort of sexy, colourful, impressive creatures. But that the smaller ones, the maybe less colourful ones, he often called them the little brown jobs, or he sometimes called them the little ones of God. And he felt those species... Well, he felt all species, but those in particular, they all had a role to play, an important role to play in their ecosystems. The things that hold the planet together, that we all rely on, whether it's the animals, the plants, or ourselves. And so he was a great champion of these little brown jobs. And the passage you're referring to, it comes from one of his early works from West Africa, about a pair of toads. And let me just read it, because again, it's very vintage Durrell, if I may. Let me find this, Vikram. So he's in Cameroons in West Africa, and has just collected a pair of these things called browleaf toads. He gives the scientific name for them, which is Bufo superciliaris. Superciliaris. The browleaf, on first acquaintance, gives the impression of being overwhelmingly supercilious. Above its large eyes, the skin is hitched up into two little points, so that the creature has his eyebrows raised at the world in a markedly sardonic manner. The immensely wide mouth adds to this impression of aristocratic conceit. By drooping gently at the corners, thus giving the toad a faintly sneering expression. Add to this the slow, swaggering walk and the fact that the creature squats down every 2 or 3 steps and gazes at you with a sort of pitying disdain, and you begin to feel that superciliousness could not go much further. My 2 brow leaves squatted side by side on a bed of fresh grass in the bottom of the basket and gazed up at me with expressions of withering scorn. I tipped the basket on its side, and they waddled out onto the floor with all the indignation and dignity of a couple of Lord Mayors who'd been accidentally locked in a public lavatory. But let me finish this passage, okay? He said, I just discovered after a few hours' acquaintance with my plump roommates that I had sadly misjudged them, for they were not the arrogant, conceited creatures they pretended to be. They were actually shy and easily embarrassed beasts, completely lacking in self-confidence. And I discovered this quite by accident the night of their arrival. I was making notes on them while they squatted on the floor at my feet, looking as though they were composing their own entries for Burke's Peerage. Wanting to examine them more closely, I bent down and picked up one of them between finger and thumb. He uttered a loud, indignant belch at this treatment and kicked out with his fat hind legs. Eventually, when I replaced him on the ground next to his companion, he was a different toad altogether. Gone were his aristocratic expressions. He was a deflated and humble amphibian. He crouched down, blinking his great eyes nervously, while a sad and timid expression spread over his face. He looked almost as if he were going to cry.
And there's much more in that chapter about the toad's relationship with the monkey, and it's incredible how each of them is just so comes to life in such a delightful fashion. But now let's move.
Now let's get serious.
Get serious and get to what used to be the Jersey Wildlife Preservation Trust and is now the Durrell Trust. And how did that come into being?
Well, as I said, Jerry always had in his own mind he would have his own zoo, and he decided it was going to be a conservation-focused zoo. But it was going to cost a lot of money to start something like this. And in fact, a lot of people thought he was crazy. His friend at the time, David Attenborough, was a friend at the time, and he told David about this idea, and David said, well, you're mad. You're absolutely mad. Anyway, Jerry persisted. But to try to get money, he wrote to his brother, Lawrence, who was already famous by this time. This is a good excerpt from this letter to Lawrence, which is 1954, fully 5 years before he actually started the Jersey Zoo. So Jerry's writing to Larry and telling him all about his first book and how it was successful. But he goes on to say, now I wish to propound an idea to you on which I should like your help and cooperation. I am now, I think, sufficiently well known to attempt something which I've had in mind for a number of years. To you, no doubt, it will sound completely mad and a lot of rubbish. But I want to start a trust or organization with land in somewhere like the West Indies for the breeding of those forms of animal life which are on the borders of extinction and which without help of this sort cannot survive. What I should like to know from you is, who do you know that is stinking rich? If I could find 3 or 4 people who would be willing between them to put up £10,000, I could get the whole thing started.
Isn't that a question that all of us would like to ask? Who do you know that is stinking rich, that will support Durrell, that will support this literary meet, that will support all the things that need to be supported but are not being supported in this world? So, but he did get it started. It's still going, and it has branched out. So if you could take us through, I mean, this is not writing necessarily, but if you could take us through where the Durrell Trust is and what it's doing across the world, and bring us back to India, maybe.
Okay, I could certainly do that. There are several chapters towards the end of the book that do set out Jerry's journey through his zoo and how it sort of developed. From the beginning, though, of course, we had the mission. The mission statement is saving animals from extinction. That's probably the most elegant mission statement I have ever heard. 4 words, and that's exactly what we do. And at the very beginning, we were concentrating a lot on breeding endangered species. But as Jerry knew very well, there was no point in breeding species. You know, you weren't saving a species by having it in a zoo. You can only save it by having it alive and thriving in its natural habitat and able to persist. And so we branched out into working with species in the wild, in the field, setting up breeding programs in their own countries, by the way. We started working in Mauritius. You probably all know the island of Mauritius in the Indian Ocean was where the famous dodo lived, and the dodo became extinct several hundred years ago. Jerry was absolutely obsessed with this bird, and he said that he did not want to see any other species go into oblivion, become extinct as the dodo had, not on his watch. So that's
the dodo is the logo of the Durrell Trust as well.
Yeah, and that's why it is the logo of our trust. So you see it all over our stuff. Anyway, so that was Mauritius. We also work in Madagascar. We work in Brazil. And the work has really expanded to include not only breeding, either at our Jersey Zoo or in the country of origin, but also to do research on the ecosystems, to understand the animals in their wild state, to do a lot of community conservation. We work with, at the very grassroots level, with the people who live in the areas where these wild animals are from, the ones that we're trying to save. We also do a lot of training. We have something called the Durrell Conservation Academy that was started back in the late 70s in our property next door to the zoo in Jersey. And we've had, since that time, the late 70s, we've had more than 7,000 people from 2/3 of the countries around the world come to study with us, study our animals, work with our staff, and then go back to their home countries to work in the field of conservation. And in fact, India is one of the places where we had so many students from, well over 100. I mean, it's probably 200 by now, I should say. And I'm hoping this next week I'll stay on for a few days and get to see a number of our graduates from our academy. It's always a great pleasure. And so our strategy has become, so this is over the years, first the strategy, simply saving species from extinction, very much an animal species-focused thing. But then as time went on, we started this work in the 1980s, restoring ecosystems, so habitats that had been so degraded that their component species could no longer exist. We started restoring those systems, and it was a place, an island near Mauritius, where we worked hard to bring the animals back by restoring the systems. We do this now in Brazil, Madagascar, the Caribbean, all the places we work. But one of the places that you could imagine was nearest and dearest to Jerry's heart was his birthplace. And it was in, who's ever heard of a little creature called the pygmy hog? Raise your hand. Oh, quite a few. Well, that's pretty good. That's not bad at all. The pygmy hog is the smallest member of the pig family, and it's found only in the grasslands of Assam. And it was thought to be extinct for many years until it was rediscovered on a tea estate in Assam in about 1969 or 1970. And Jerry got to hear about this, and he was absolutely determined that he had to do something to save this tiny little pig from extinction. And again, this was a typical of the little brown jobs. It wasn't the big tiger, it wasn't the rhinoceros, but it was this little pygmy hog. Turns out the pygmy hog, of course, is a big, an important ecological indicator because it's very sensitive to changes in its habitat. And so if you can keep your pygmy hogs alive in a certain habitat, then for sure you're going to be saving the rhinos and the tigers and the water buffaloes and such. So this is a very sort of typical Durrell thing. Anyway, we started a breeding program. It took many years to get established, but this was actually in Assam, in Guwahati. And from a very low number of pygmy hogs, probably just in the low hundreds, believed to exist at the time, we have now bred hundreds of them and have released nearly 200 into the wild, not only in Manas National Park, which is where the little stronghold was, but in several other parks and protected areas in Assam, and working closely with local folks there to try to restore the grasslands, to get rid of invasive species and just make the grasslands safe, not only for pygmy hogs, but for rhinos, tigers, floricans, and things like that. And that's really one of the projects that we're most proud of. And I should say, of course, we're working with the Department of Forestry and the Ministry of Environment and all of that. But it's a great program. Unfortunately, I'm not going to visit this time. I was there 6 years ago. But if you ever get a chance to go up there, do so. A beautiful, beautiful part of India.
And to bring it back to Gerald Durrell and his writing, and then maybe we can open for questions. What did he see the future as? I think there is something that you want to share from the book.
Yes. There's something that he wrote. It was like in 1988. It was buried in a time capsule by Princess Anne, now the Princess Royal, but she is our patron. But it's something that I think Jerry, people would often ask him, did he have any hope for the world? And he would say, well, if I didn't have hope, you'd find me on a desert island drinking myself to death. But, he didn't do that. He was very much an activist. But he also had hope. And I just want to read this passage because I think it's so moving. He said, this is the end of the time capsule piece, "We hope that there will be fireflies and glowworms at night to guide you, and butterflies in hedges and forests to greet you. We hope that your dawns will have an orchestra of birdsong, and that the sound of their wings and the opalescence of their coloring will dazzle you. We hope that there will still be extraordinary varieties of creatures sharing the land of the planet with you to enchant you and enrich your lives as they've done for us. We hope that you will be grateful for having been born into such a magical world." Okay.
On that note, starting with awe, ending with magic. Questions, comments? Do we have microphones? Yes.
Hello, hi. Thank you for a great session, and just wanted to ask, so in all of during his collection years when he was collecting animals for the zoos elsewhere, not his own, I have not yet come across a book that he came to India, came back to India and collected. So why was that?
I'm not sure why that was. He wanted to go all over the world. He really did. But he didn't come back to India until it was 1978 was his first time back in India. And that was when he got so interested in the pygmy hog. But he often talked about India, but for some reason he never... I guess he was just so busy in other parts of the world. Thank you.
In front.
Thank you for reading those passages. In fact, that passage about the ship to just arriving in Corfu is one of my favorite passages in that book. So I wanted to ask, what is your hypothesis about this extraordinary concatenation of writing talent in one family? Gerald, I love Lawrence Durrell too, and Jacqueline Durrell was also such a gifted writer. And the other question was, what do you think, because I think it's slightly unfair because I'm asking you to ventriloquize for him, but what do you think he would have made of the ITV series, The Durrells, which I loved and devoured all seasons of?
Okay, thank you for that question. That's good. And did you know his sister, Margaret, also wrote?
Yes. She's my favorite character in my family and other animals.
Well, she eventually wrote a book called Whatever Happened to Margot, so that was good. And they've actually been trying to do a sequel to the Durrells TV series based on her book, but they've not found the funding yet. But she wrote another book, which was also very funny, called Growing Old Disgracefully. And it was all about her adventures on board a ship. She ran a boutique on a Greek ship around the world. So anyway, that one was never published. They were never published, actually, but we have the manuscript still. So explain how you find these writers. And Jackie herself wrote, of course. I don't know. Isn't there a session here about writers in families? And I don't know if it's this afternoon or anyway. And I don't know if anybody can explain it. Because, I mean, one thing I also can't explain is this sort of affinity for animals that you have from birth, I think. Jerry had it from birth. I had it from birth. My brother hasn't a clue. My sister has it. So, anyway, and about the TV series, The Durrells, how many people saw that or have seen that? Yeah, a number of people. It departed in some major ways from Jerry's books about Corfu. But, you know, hey, that's television. It was really good television and sort of, you know, of the time. And I think it was great. And it brought the Durrell name back to the forefront of people's minds. And I think that can only be a very good thing from the point of view of Jerry's work in conservation and such. Okay.
That gentleman there, I'm afraid that has to be the last one, sorry.
Yeah, hi, thank you. Thank you for an excellent session. I just wanted to find out how he dealt with the loss of creatures that he had. He writes with such deep empathy and obviously has a lot of connection to. Quite a few of them would die early. I mean, animals' lifespans being what they are. How did he deal with loss of those creatures in a life shared with him? Could you tell us how that happened?
That's a really difficult question. It's a good question, probably a good one from all of us who who have pets. I mean, I just, you know, can't even imagine the day when my animals are going to go. I mean, I might go before they do, but how did he deal with it? I don't really know. He and I didn't have pets together, actually, because we were traveling so much, and we divided our time between the flat in Jersey, and we had a little house in the south of France, and then we would travel doing television work or writing for him. So we didn't have close pets per se. And so I mean, how do you deal with it? It's just it leaves a horrible hole in your heart. But, you know, you just have to get on with life, whether it's your pet or your family or whatever. But I'll tell you, we did have a few pets. Did I tell you this story? For our 10th wedding anniversary, Jerry got me 4 tarantulas. I thought this was a great present, of course. And so I had them in a big, you know, different terraria in the flat in Jersey. And then when we would travel, had to ask his secretary to look after them. And she was never very pleased at that. Thank you.
On that note, thank you very much. I know there are a couple of other questions. This book is available at the bookstore. It's the Corfu trilogy. It has all the 3 Corfu books. And would you be willing to sign copies?
Yes, of course. I shall certainly sign that.
So you
be very happy to do. And
get the book,
anybody more questions,
signed,
Vikram,
and have
they
your
can
questions
ask me.
answered at the bookstore.
Right,
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.